findings, as well as that begs my question to you, and if you've already seen it or it's not true, that did the Ethiopian Jews and the Ethiopian Christians live together? And did, when Jesus, or when he had to flee, did both of them accept Jesus and, you know, protect him until he had to come into in his prophetic way?
Now, what you're thinking about when he had to flee, you're talking about when he fled to Egypt?
Oh, it's Egypt. Never mind.
Yeah, so I just want to help us. And that's one of the things we look at in the class I teach. Is for the most part, the way Europeans interpret African origins of Christianity is that they kind of lump everything into Egypt. You know, we kind of do this lumping thing.
Right.
And so we have to do our own work of going back and geographically situating all of these different locales that speak to the particularities of the African experience. So I'm hearing what you're saying, but it's important to note that Jesus didn't necessarily go to Ethiopia, per se. But it also shows us that these communities were not as Christian as we want to assume when we're reading our text. So these early communities were early Jewish Christian communities, to get at your question there. And we tend to overlook the Jewishness of our Christian heritage. So there's no way to be a good Christian without understanding Judaism.
Without understanding early Judaism. Because one of the things that your question makes me want to say is there was no such thing as a Christian community when Jesus fled. I mean, you know,
so all of these
the notion of Christianity is overlaid on Jesus' life. Jesus was not a Christian. He was a Jewish boy, and as my rabbi say, a good Jewish boy. He was a good Jewish boy. He'd have made a good husband. That's what my rabbi says. And so some of what we have to do, now this would be a womanist project, is to disentangle the ways in which we have also taught ourselves to hate Judaism.
Right.
And to despise it and to say things like, oh, well, but they killed Jesus. And to read the biblical text with that in mind. So what I really want us to know is that much of what we're reading is not Bible. We're reading the history we've learned about the Bible.
And that's why it's so hard to sit with the text and hear your questions. Or own your questions. Because we already think we know what's in there.
We already think we know what it is.
So that hermeneutic that you gave the group earlier about just read the text. And just ask your question.
Ask your question before you ever pick. I'm not saying you shouldn't pick up a commentary. I've written them. You better pick one up. So I'm not saying you don't do that. I'm saying that's not a first step for getting at preaching prophetically. And I'm not also saying that what you are thinking can't be corrected. Because this is why you go to other sources and other resources. But not until you know what you want to ask. You can't even have your questions tempered or changed because you don't have them. If you go to commentary or books and say, oh, well, Dr. Valerie says that, so that must be what it is, before you even know what you're asking, before you yourself have wrestled with that text. I like the notion of Jacob wrestling by Jabbok, right? You know, with whatever that is he's wrestling with. What is that? A man? An angel? An theophany? You know, a theophany rather? Is it God? Is it, you know, you cannot, what is he wrestling with? That no matter what, he comes away limping before he gets a blessing. So my thing is wrestle with the text even if you've got to come away limping. Even if you don't know what you're wrestling with. If it's your own mind, if it's the tradition of the church, if it's God, God's own self. And I have discovered, now this I do say, I've discovered in the years that I've been a Christian that God can take our questions. We can't take our questions sometimes. And the church, sure enough, can't take them sometimes. But God is not opposed to our questions. Now, Job might not like the answer God give. I kind of think that's a lame answer to Job. Where were you when I found the earth? You know, when Job is like, really, God? What did I do to you? Like, this is how you treat your friends. Like, for real, God. You know. But when I'm reading the book of Job, I always go to the 42nd chapter, and I think it's the 7th verse, where God says to Job's friends to make an offering and ask Job for forgiveness because everything Job said about God is right. Now, what's scary about that is Job said some pretty stuff about God. So we don't read those intervening chapters because we usually read the first 3 and the last 2. Because we don't read the Bible. We read